For this podcast, we're going to be going on a little bit of a section of the Constitution, going over sections 1, 2, and 3. This section, to continue on our series on the U.S. Constitution, this is going to be in section 1. Before this point, I'm going to be asking people to consider donating to my Patreon page and become patrons to it. There's a whole story that will show you my background on patreon.com/challengehistory, and the donations per month start at $1 and go all the way up to $100. Later on, as I get people in, I'll start adding on things for better benefits for the $50 and $100 range for more ideas of vintage silver and gold coins for the $50 and $100 range. It would be like one winner, depending on how much we're getting in those ranges. It would be most likely per year if there weren't many. But if we end up getting quite a few of them, it might be as few. It might be as frequent as quarterly giveaways. The $25 it might be if we get quite a few of those, we might be doing a yearly giveaway of something of within that sort, just not just of much lesser value. $10 and base levels, we get quite a few of those. Those are going to be basically initially probably something of lesser value. It might be going into the idea of unique currency from other countries that I might select, so that people can kind of get the idea of some ideas of historical figures from other nations, and or even historical documents that are actually professionally printed, and use those for those levels for giveaways. But that would be in the future down the road. When it comes down to it, I really appreciate any level that anybody could donate at, because it really means a great deal. But right now with it, we're going to go to what you're going to see right here on my list of my schedules. Is first what was initially planned, kind of where we're still running a day behind, is Article 1. And we're going to be going to that with the Constitution here. First, we got to read through each section, then we'll go over each section. Now, not all sections are going to be having important things, because a lot of them go into more of the general features of what determines eligibility for certain things, because Section 1 follows the actual legislature of the government, of the federal government, and most of it goes over the points of what makes them eligible and what their qualifications happen to be. So a lot of those we're going to skip over, because you'll find those just in the generic history lessons that you've probably have received over the years, or what you're going to find elsewhere. And there's really no point to go over those in great detail. Section 1 says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in Congress of the United States, which shall consist of the Senate and House of Representatives. This is very important, because what we need to understand is that this means that when we look at the legislative powers, they're not going to anybody else. This means the executive cannot state that he has a pen and a phone and wants to essentially change law because of some emotional plea. This refers to, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, we're referring to Donald Trump on his wall, or referring to Barack Obama on immigration, on any type of need when it comes to that. It doesn't matter. They don't have the authority because all legislative authority goes into the legislative branches itself, being the Senate and the House of Representatives. And when we look at, even with what the judicial branch has done, how they try to rewrite things to be constitutional, they cannot do it either. The executive nor the judicial have any legislative powers. As it states right here, bluntly, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in Congress of the United States. It could not be any more clear than that. There is no variability in what they're stating, and you cannot state that, oh, I believe in a living document a living document type of idea with it, because the fact is with as clear as it states it right there, this means that no other branch can essentially create law or do anything else because their powers are strictly limited to what it states here. And as we know that the Constitution is a rule book, and this is what it's meant to do. When we see the amendments, they're meant to specifically list specifically the Bill of Rights that we just went over. Those were essentially meant to list rights in a way of what the government cannot do. Now when we go to Section 2, Section 2 primarily goes over the qualifications. The only the only exceptions on this happens to be what we're talking about is the what we call the 3/5 clause. Now, the 3/5 clause, it was because what they would do early on in a lot of these states that had slavery is they would actually count their slaves as people when it came down to the census, but not when it came down to actually voters. This meant that what they would do is they would say, we'll count slaves as 3/5 of a person to account to essentially reduce these down in the actual voting total, so that what they do is they do not overcount these people, so they have more power than they're legitimately allowing because of the actual real vote totals. It was not actually meant to say that that in reality that's a slave is 3/5 of an actual person. That was not what it was actually meaning. It was essentially trying to reduce the impacts in a way that could actually pass of an actual vote in the actual to actually make the Constitution of being able to pass this, so that the northern states were not going to be overrun by these some of the northern states that were not going to accept as many slaves were not going to be overrun by some of the other slaves, some of the other states that had higher numbers of slaves. And this was the whole idea of this 3/5 clause. And this is something completely that has been taken completely out of context. And when we see this, this is one of the major things with it. Another point that's that would have been taken interesting that we need to note is that basically is that it says in the bottom, the House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers and shall have sole power of impeachment. This is the impeachment trial itself, and the Senate will do the removal of office. and this is why we have this. And Section 2 tends to go over the role of the House, whereas Section 3 tends to go over the removal of office, which shows right here in the bottom. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than removal of office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States, but the party convicted shall nonetheless be liable in and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to the law. This is why we go into Section 3 right here. And this goes under the idea of the what happens with the Senate. And it basically goes under the standards of the Senate, and then the Vice President of the United States shall be the essentially the tie-breaking vote for the actual system. For any votes of that will be essentially the one to and basically and otherwise he will have no vote. And this is the whole point of his position. And other than that, the Senate will choose their officers and a president pro tempore in absence of the vice president, or when he shall exercise the office of president of the United States. So basically is and then basically on the trial for the removal of office is basically you will have the Chief Justice will preside for those cases, and that you must have 2/3 you must have concurrence of 2/3 members present, and which means if you don't have 2/3 of the members that are essentially confirmed on that case, it does not lead to removal of office. Which is why traditionally it doesn't happen unless there is on these is to remove any politicization of the case. That's why when we look at Section 4. Basically, it doesn't go over any such real essential matters. Section 5. We're talking. It's really doesn't have any essential matters really either. These are more in the actual Section 4 and Section 5 are really going into the actual conduct. Section 6 is basically saying that they're supposed to receive a salary, or I should say compensation for their services, with exception of if they have treason, felony, breach of the peace, during their attendance of session, blah 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 blah, and it continues like that. And it says that they cannot have any other titles. No senator or representatives can have any other titles. This is under Section 6 while they are appointed as a senator. For Section 7, one important thing is it says right here, all bills raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but Senate may propose or concur with the amendments as on other bills. And then it goes for what it continues on the next part, which is basically once it's passed, it goes to the president. He can sign it within. Then it shows how they can actually get it past the president by supermajority vote, which is pretty simple. When we get to Section 8, Section 8 is the key point. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, which is key, but it does not state the actual point as income taxes being technically lawful. Now, there's also been questions on if income taxes as the definition of income of being the definition of wages through labor is actually lawful, because technically the term of income is actually meant to mean profit in the original sense. And when we start to look at that, when we're talking about that, we mean business profit through actually the sale of goods. So there's actually been a question on that, of that being lawful. Duties, imposts, and excises to pay for debts provided for the common defense and welfare of the United States. Now, when we see the word common defense, we need to understand that's not a global common defense, a common defense of other nations, such as NATO or the UN or any other allies. It's a common defense, and when it says general welfare, it means for basically the security. And it says just the United States alone. Does not mean allies, it means the United States alone. Now, there was a key to this, because when we use this term, it's meant to actually refer to the it's meant to refer to what the original foreign policy of the nation was. We were meant not to keep any entangling alliances, and this is something that our founders insisted upon. And something which has kind of been lost is they try to change around the term of common defense in what is constitutional, and the terminology of common defense from what's the you are going to find from a lot of progressives from the progressive era. Now, the progressive era felt that common defense meant we had to work to police the world, and it was what they call a liberal foreign policy perspective, which meant that we can go in the world, we can change up all these other countries, carve them up, and we had this idea that we were going to create this global utopia without expecting any backlash, which is, as we know, that's called insanity, because you have to understand that you can't start carving up someone's country, start moving things around, and expect people not to get angry. That's like just busting into someone's house, rearranging their furniture, kicking them out, putting someone in, and then putting them into what it called some other side of town that might be basically a horrible broken down residence, and acting like they should just be just fine. No, if the outcome of that is going to be that you're going to have huge blowback. And that's the whole point. Now, the general welfare clause does not mean, what it meant welfare was just basically means security as well. That's why it was actually grouped together. And it didn't mean welfare as in you are taking care of people cradle to grave. Welfare was not, because they didn't believe in any welfare. If you look at the point of the actual Constitution at this point, they were not having any form of government assistance. And government assistance did not even exist, which meant if it would have existed at that point, they would have essentially put it in at that instance. But the problem is, when we're talking about the term welfare or general welfare, where this term has actually been bastardized for the actual need of buying off votes. And it says, but all duties, imposts, exercises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Basically meaning that you cannot basically charge people more based on whatever point you're stating, based on race, based on religion, based on gender, based on income level. They all have to be within the same rates. This means whatever types of taxation that you're doing, they all have to be within the same rates within the United States. This means you cannot do a progressive nor a regressive tax. It must be technically a flat tax. And this is the whole point, that if you were to impose a tax throughout the United States from the federal level, that you must do it within a flat rate, because otherwise, essentially, you're violating the Constitution. And that's the whole point. And this is why we had that specifically right there. And that's essentially what you're doing right there. And essentially, the current system is unconstitutional because we have a progressive tax. Even the term of a regressive tax. So essentially, the only way that they could do this is essentially created at a flat rate, which the only way they could do that with people not wanting to kill each other would be to take the bottom rates, which if we look at the tax rates of 2019, you're going to see the bottom rate is 10%. Now, in order to keep people from wanting to kill each other, to not so that we're not trying to essentially kill the poor more than it would be, we could assume that basically that rate would have to be at 10%. Now, you're going to have the people like socialists are going to say, well, hey, you're only taxing, you're giving the rich essentially a 27% tax cut. But the fact is a lot of people you're giving between anywhere between a 2%. You could be giving them a 12%, you can give them between a 14%, a 22%, a 25%, or a 27% tax cut, and that's the whole point. And what needs to be understood is that this is where things need to be shown, and that's the whole point. And that's where it would be. And even on the old rates where we had a 15% in the middle of it, it needs to be understood that would add another one as well. But the fact is nothing higher than a 10% should exist based on this point. Now, if we go in, which means if we were to do this, this would force essentially most of these programs would have to be massively cut, because our median rate would essentially be more than double. And it shows right here now to borrow the credit of the United States. Now, if you look up here, is to pay for the debts right up here, which means that we have to pay off these debts. Essentially, if they're not doing that, they're essentially not following the Constitution, which means if they're not doing that, essentially, and they're only doing this, they're essentially violating the Constitution, which means what they need to be doing is they need to be looking from the level of what's constitutional. To regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states and with Indian tribes. This is essentially basically making sure that commerce is moving smoothly. This does not mean that this does not mean regulate from the actual term of setting regulations, as the term is changed. The term regulate refers originally to essentially create order, and that's what it originally was meaning. That's all it meant, was essentially create an order with these things to essentially make everything run smoothly, and that's the only thing it meant. It did not mean to what it called to create more red tape, and it never meant that. And that's not what the term regulate means, and that's one thing that's been abused to create the war on drugs, to create essentially a lot of red tape for people to actually do business with other countries, with each other. And it's created a lot of problems. Here's to establish uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws subject to bankruptcies throughout the United States. Now, one problem that's happened is this uniform rule of naturalization is they've used that to abuse the system and basically create favored nations and favored groups that can come into the country and get immigration status. Now, it just says naturalization, does not say anything about immigration. Now, the only thing that should be impacting on immigration is when we're looking at it should be, as it says up here, on common defense and general welfare. So when we look at that, that should be basically is, do they pass an actual security test? Do they pass basically a background check? Do they pass that security type of check? If they pass that, come right in. Now, what they've done is they've abused this point to basically say, okay, your people are getting married too often to U.S. males, so we're going to block your females up to a certain age from coming into this country. And this is what happens, and this has been noted by a lot of immigration attorneys. This happens to women from Russia, women from Thailand, women from the Philippines, and they'll do this with a lot of the top ones, regardless of what they actually bring in income when they actually enter. Now, when we look at the income levels, as noted, we look at the top 5, we see India, we see Australia, we see the Thailand, we see the Philippines and England. And I believe it's India first, then Australia. I believe it's actually in that order: India, Australia, the Taiwan, the Philippines, then England. So when we look at that, it's those should be the favored people to enter the country, and the people that are in the bottom, when we see the people who are rock bottom are Somalia, followed by right above that would be I believe it's Iraq, followed by I think it's Burma, then Dominican Republic, and then Mexico. So those would be the 5 that would not want to be based on income for what would be promoting economic success. Now, you would mix that with the actual amount of security threats of, do they pass an actual background check? And when we start to look at this, that should be the only concerns, because we currently, because if we want to help out the whole process is to end public aid, and that would get people off these things. But when we look at the people near the top, they're near that top for a reason. They're near that top because they're not accepting public aid, because public aid would put them near the bottom. They wouldn't waste their time on that. Now when we look at to the next part is to coin money, to regulate value thereof, and foreign coin, and fix standard and weights and measures. Now it says nothing. Now number 1 is the executive has been taking over this power. This is one problem on that, to coin money. Number 2 is we see that the executive is doing it through the finance department and the Federal Reserve Bank, which is a semi-private bank that's been actually taking over that power. Number two, they've been doing it through actually printing money. Now, it says nothing here about printing money. It says to coin money. This means an actual metal coin. Now, what did they actually mean back then? They meant coins of lower values were to be set through, as you'll see later in this standard weights and measures, which meant those were to basically be setting ones of lower values, but the highest values were supposed to be gold and silver. And this is key. And then when we look at this, it was supposed to be based off foreign coins. Now, we were never supposed to basically print money. It never says print, and there's a reason for that. We were never supposed to go to a fiat currency. We were always supposed to have coined money, and they knew how to print money. There had been other cultures throughout society that had gone to fiat currencies that had failed, and they knew that, and they were not going to go down that route. And this is one of the things the founders had already put on the table. And they wanted to base it off other foreign coins. And they would have, if foreigners had put it under fiat currencies, they would have based our thing off their fiat currencies and shown that our value was much higher. Next thing is to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting and securities and current coins of the United States. Note, it does not say anything about actual printed money. Never shows anything about printed money because it never thought of that as being constitutional. They had printed documents before. This was actually printed. This was an actual document itself. There was printed documents as early as, we're talking 200 years before this point. When we're talking about printed documents, they were actually made facsimiles thereof. So when we're talking about this is not exactly something new to them. So they knew that this had happened before, and they wanted punishment for those counterfeiting these coins. But they would have also viewed anybody making paper money as it being counterfeit as well. Another point is to establish the post offices and post roads. Mind you, this is just to establish and to post roads. This is not to actually build. This is only to essentially order. Note, this is nothing more than that. To promote the progress of science and useful arts. Note, this is just to basically promote them. This is just a verbal promotion, not paying for. Mind you, if you look at their initial budgets, when it came down to it, they were not paying for them. And it says by securing limited times to authors and inventors to exclusive rights to the respective writings and discoveries. Mind you, it says limited times. It does not say that they had these unlimited times to their discoveries and exclusive rights. It did not give them unlimited times on these points. And there was a reason why, because they were not going to essentially create a system where people could abuse copyright laws, because they knew that could easily happen. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, basically establishing courts below, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed at the high seas. This is essentially a definition of what and offenses against the laws of nations. Basically, this is essentially what this was done is to essentially make definition of terrorism right here. That's essentially what they're doing right there. So they knew terrorism existed. Now you might go, well, why did they write the Fourth Amendment so direct then? Well, they did this because they knew that terrorism existed, and they knew that they could still guard against it with still respecting people's right to privacy and right to be their actual individual selves. And they had all the things with these, and the terrorists were essentially using the same weapons that they were using back then. The only difference is you might say, oh, but they have access to stealing planes. Well, the fact is that's the only difference when it comes down to it is planes. You might go, oh, but they also have phones. Okay, they have phones. The fact is it doesn't mean that they're not going to have the communications. They'll be able to hide their communications just as well back then with hiding their actual letters. Well, they knew back then you would have to get an actual warrant, and an individual warrant at that. You can't just go through everybody's stuff and say, oh, we're going to look around until we find whoever it is. And this is the thing that they knew. And here's another one that's very important. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Now this declare war is very important. This means that anything involving an act of war, no matter what the case is, with exception of basically of true imminent attack on U.S. soil, or actually an act of defense, basically we're talking that they have the actual ability to basically call for declaration of war, or actually calling for an act of war. And this is what's very important. The executive has no authority. Doesn't matter if he states, oh, I can do this for 30 days or 90 days or up to 90 days. I can do this for 30 days or up to 90 days. Well, on that basic authority, when the president's stating it, that means he can jump from country to country to country to country and do it forever. And there's a reason why that there is no authority under that, because he'll just jump from country to country and pick basically, he could pick up to, essentially on that basis, all he has to do is pick 4 countries. 4 countries, and he can continually go to war around the clock without a declaration of war. And this is why you don't, this is why we don't have this, because essentially he can say, I can do this for 30 days and reauthorize it 3 times and then jump to the next one. And that's what they can essentially do, as long as they're not back to back, as long as they're not crossing over. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money shall be for longer than a term of 2 years. Well, guess what? They've essentially appropriated money that has gone has been asked for periods over 2 years. That would be unconstitutional. To make rules for the government and regulations of land and naval forces. Essentially, they've allowed the executive to do this. To provide for calling forth the militia and to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections and rebel invasions. Basically, what the militia is enacting in that is essentially it's acting as a force to protect the of armed individuals, to essentially protect the Union itself when they have people who essentially want to take down the actual Union. When the Union is acting constitutional. Since we basically have pretty much, they're not respecting the Second Amendment, we essentially do not have what would be allowed for this, and any group that would potentially do this is essentially deemed as domestic terrorists. So essentially that cannot even be put into play. To provide for army and disciplining the militia, and for governing parts of them may be employed in the service of the United States, serving to the states respectively appointed to the officers and authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Guess what? They have not been doing that, and they have not been doing that for a long time, because as memos we've seen from Janet Napolitano, she believes returning veterans are the biggest threat to the nation, which means the government will surely not be doing this. they surely are not going to essentially arm the people and train them to exercise legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 square miles as section of particular states, and the acceptance of Congress may seat in government of the United States, and the exercise like authority over places by the consent of the legislature of the states in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. This is basically what gives the District of Columbia its setting, and what the statement for what a military construction is, and what makes for the military construction of basically what gives them allowance to do with military constructions within the United States. And this allows for forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. Note, it does not say anything about walls. This is why the actual statement on Trump's action is completely unlawful. To make all laws which be necessary and proper for carrying out the execution foregoing powers and all of the powers vested in this Constitution of the Government of the United States and in any department or officer thereof. Now we get into Section 9. Basically, it's Section 9 sets the limitations to basically a lot of limits to what taxation can be done, taxations and duties. And that no money can be drawn from the Treasury but consequences from appropriations made by law. So if it's not appropriated for by law, the money cannot be drawn from the Treasury, which is another point that that actually would go against what Trump has done. And then it ends up with no title of nobility shall be granted. Section 10 goes over the idea that no state can enter in a treaty, alliance, or confederation. And then no state without consent of Congress can lay imposts, duties, imports, or exports. And no state without the consent of Congress can lay any duty on tonnage to keep troops, ships in wartime, or in wartime, and ships of war in time of peace, enter an agreement or compact with another state or foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded, or in imminent danger, as will not admit of delay. So basically what that does is that basically limits what states can do when it comes to alliances. And this is specific because when it comes down to these of treaties and alliances, it knew that that we were not supposed to engage in these because essentially it essentially creates a separation of what nations would do. Just like the United States was not meant to actually create an alliance itself. That's why it would do it. And even up here in that no state was allowed to coin money. Now emit bills of credit, and the only thing that was allowed to pay debts off with was gold and silver coin. Now, this is what it essentially meant was what would have been the top levels of money within the U.S. system. Never says anything about actually using paper, and this is key again. So when we go over the whole thing with it, these are the actual limits. Now when we look at it, they have to stick to these limits, plus within what's in the limits on the Constitution from the amendments themselves, and what's in the limits from what it states the powers of the executive on Section 2 and the judicial power are on Section 3. While Section 4 goes into some minor stuff with it, that's basically, we end up skipping over that because that's basically full faith and credit, and citizens basically get are entitled to all faith and immunities of several states. The new states admitted in are basically admitted to the union, and then basically that's they'll guarantee every state in the union Republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion. So it's basically it's pretty much pointless from what we see in Section 4. That's why we don't really go over that. We don't go over Section 6 because that's basically going over the idea of all debts and engagements entered into and adopted in the Congress shall be valid against the United States under this Constitution, under the Federation, basically saying that we have to pay back our debts, which is, when we look at the modern monetary theory, this is what actually defeats it right there. It's stating that we can't just start adding up debt because we have to pay it back. There's people that are actually owed money. We can't just say we're going to print our way out of it. And then the Article 7 is basically going under the definitions and define the words, and stating that basically it's ratifying itself. The only one we're going to go over later is Article 5, and that's going to be at a later time. That's about it with this one. If you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure that you share it all the way around social media. Make sure that you get all your friends and everyone to subscribe to my channel, and make sure that you can try to see if you can get them interested in being a patron on my Patreon page. Thanks, everyone. Bye.